It's hard to imagine how much a single person can change the course of history. Yet, sometimes it's one person's courage, resilience, and vision that plants the seed for transformation. Picture a small, quiet town, a place where everyone seems to know everyone, where traditions run deep, and where history often hides in plain sight. Now imagine a newcomer stepping into this town, carrying not just a lesson plan but a spark, a belief in the power of education, and the untold stories that deserve to be brought to light. This is the story of a Black teacher whose determination to teach the truth reshaped not only the classroom but the entire town. The year was 1965, a time when the civil rights movement was in full swing, and the fight for equality and justice reverberated across the nation. Our story begins in a town, much like any other in the segregated South, a place steeped in its own version of history, where the stories of the past were carefully curated, leaving out the voices of those who had lived it most painfully. This town had its traditions, its monuments, its heroes, but it also had its silences. Deep silences about the struggles and contributions of its Black residents. Silences that one teacher was about to break. Miss Clara Johnson, a young, passionate educator fresh out of college, arrived in the town with a teaching position at the local school. From the moment she stepped off the bus, she felt the weight of being different. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a Black teacher in a predominantly white town, a role that carried both challenges and expectations. But Clara wasn't one to back down. She had been raised to believe that education wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about truth, empowerment, and liberation. Clara's first day in the classroom was like stepping into uncharted territory. The students stared at her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She greeted them with warmth and confidence, determined to win them over. She taught math and science, reading and writing, but it was during history lessons that her passion truly came alive. She noticed the glaring omissions in the textbooks, the stories of Black inventors, activists, and leaders absent from the pages. She noticed how the local history glorified certain events while conveniently ignoring others. And she realized that if she didn't teach her students the whole truth, no one else would. One day, Clara decided to assign her students a project: research the untold history of our town. She encouraged them to speak to their grandparents, search through old documents, and look beyond what they thought they already knew. At first, the idea was met with resistance. Why dig up the past? Why challenge the stories they had grown up hearing? But Clara had a way of sparking curiosity. Slowly but surely, the students began to uncover pieces of a hidden history, a history that revealed the town's deep connections to slavery, resistance, and resilience. Clara's project wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about connecting her students to their roots and showing them how history shapes the present. What they found was both shocking and inspiring. Hidden beneath the town's polished facade were stories of Black families who had fought for their freedom, built businesses, and contributed to the town's growth, only to be erased from its official narratives. The students' discoveries began to ripple through the community, raising questions and sparking conversations. Some were inspired, others were uncomfortable, but no one could ignore what was happening. As the weeks went by, Clara's efforts drew both admiration and backlash. Some parents praised her for teaching their children to think critically and embrace diversity. Others accused her of stirring up trouble. Clara knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew that the truth was worth fighting for. What she didn't know was just how deep the hidden history went, or how it would come to change not only her students but the entire town. This is where our journey begins, with a teacher who dared to challenge the status quo, a group of students who dared to ask questions, and a town on the brink of transformation. What they uncovered would not only rewrite their understanding of history, but also reshape their future. Stay with us as we dive into the incredible story of Miss Clara Johnson, her students, and the hidden history that forever changed their town. Clara hadn't anticipated just how much the project would take on a life of its own. At first, the students approached it like any other assignment, something to check off their lists. but soon they found themselves drawn into the process in ways they hadn't expected. One student, Tommy, discovered an old ledger at his grandmother's attic. It was worn and dusty, the kind of thing that might have been thrown away if not for the project. The ledger detailed transactions from a general store that had once been run by a black family in town, a family whose name wasn't mentioned in any of the town's official histories. Tommy's grandmother told him stories about the family's generosity, how they had helped people during hard times, and how the store had mysteriously burned down one night long ago. Another student, Maria, stumbled upon a collection of letters her great-grandfather had written during the Reconstruction era. The letters described the efforts of newly freed black men and women to build schools and churches, only to face threats and violence. Maria brought one of the letters to class, her hands shaking as she read it aloud. The words were raw and vivid, painting a picture of a time when hope and fear existed side by side. Clara listened, her heart heavy but determined. She knew these stories needed to be heard, no matter how difficult they were. Word of the project began to spread. Some of the students' parents were intrigued and started sharing their own stories. Others were less enthusiastic, questioning why Clara was digging into the past at all. "What's done is done," one parent told her at a PTA meeting. "We don't need to stir up old wounds." Clara met the comment with calm resolve. "History isn't just about the past," she replied. "It's about understanding where we come from so we can decide where we're going." As more stories came to light, a pattern began to emerge. There were names and events that had been deliberately omitted from the town's official accounts. Clara and her students discovered that the town had once been home to a thriving black community, with businesses, schools, and social organizations that flourished despite the challenges of segregation. But as they dug deeper, they also uncovered a darker side: stories of intimidation, arson, and forced displacement. It became clear that the erasure of these stories wasn't accidental, it was intentional. One afternoon, Clara received an anonymous letter slipped under her classroom door. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as though the writer had been nervous. The letter simply said, "You're looking in places you shouldn't. Leave it alone." Clara's heart pounded as she read the note. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her desk, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A threat? She didn't know, but she wasn't about to back down. If anything, the letter only strengthened her resolve. That evening, Clara stayed late at the school, poring over old records and archives she had borrowed from the local library. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the silence of the empty building was almost eerie. She found a map from the late 1800s that showed a part of town that no longer existed. The area, labeled New Hope, had once been a vibrant black neighborhood, but there was no mention of what had happened to it. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. What had caused an entire community to vanish without a trace? The students, too, began to sense the weight of what they were uncovering. Conversations in the classroom became more heated, more emotional. Tommy argued with a classmate who dismissed the project as unnecessary. "It's our history," Tommy shouted. "You think it doesn't matter, but it does." Clara intervened, urging them to discuss their differences respectfully, but she couldn't deny the passion she saw in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that history wasn't just about dates and facts. It was about people, real people whose lives and stories had shaped their own. Meanwhile, outside the classroom, the town itself seemed to be shifting. Local newspapers picked up on the project, and an article about Clara's work ran on the front page. While some residents praised her for bringing new energy to the school, others were less supportive. Clara overheard whispers at the grocery store, saw the way some people avoided her on the sidewalk. She tried not to let it get to her, but the tension was undeniable. One day, Clara received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man named Mr. Harris showed up at her classroom door during her lunch break. He introduced himself as a lifelong resident of the town and said he had something to show her. Clara invited him in, and he pulled out a faded photograph from his coat pocket. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a church. "That's New Hope Baptist," Mr. Harris said, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "It was the heart of our community before it was torn down." One student, Tommy, discovered an old ledger in his grandmother's attic. It was worn and dusty, the kind of thing that might have been thrown away if not for the project. The ledger detailed transactions from a general store that had once been run by a black family in town, a family whose name wasn't mentioned in any of the town's official histories. Tommy's grandmother told him stories about the family's generosity, how they had helped people during hard times, and how their store had mysteriously burned down one night long ago. Another student, Maria, stumbled upon a collection of letters her great-grandfather had written during the Reconstruction era. The letters described the efforts of newly freed black men and women to build schools and churches, only to face threats and violence. Maria brought one of the letters to class, her hands shaking as she read it aloud. The words were raw and vivid, painting a picture of a time when hope and fear existed side by side. Clara listened, her heart heavy but determined. She knew these stories needed to be heard, no matter how difficult they were. Word of the project began to spread. Some of the students' parents were intrigued and started sharing their own stories. Others were less enthusiastic, questioning why Clara was digging into the past at all. "What's done is done," one parent told her at a PTA meeting. "We don't need to stir up old wounds." Clara met the comment with calm resolve. "History isn't just about the past," she replied. "It's about understanding where we come from so we can decide where we're going." As more stories came to light, a pattern began to emerge. There were names and events that had been deliberately omitted from the town's official accounts. Clara and her students discovered that the town had once been home to a thriving black community, with businesses, schools, and social organizations that flourished despite the challenges of segregation. But as they dug deeper, they also uncovered a darker side, stories of intimidation, arson, and forced displacement. It became clear that the erasure of these stories wasn't accidental, it was intentional. One afternoon, Clara received an anonymous letter slipped under her classroom door. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as though the writer had been nervous. The letter simply said, "You're looking in places you shouldn't. Leave it alone." Clara's heart pounded as she read the note. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her desk, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A threat? She didn't know, but she wasn't about to back down. If anything, the letter only strengthened her resolve. That evening, Clara stayed late at the school, poring over old records and archives she had borrowed from the local library. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the silence of the empty building was almost eerie. She found a map from the late 1800s that showed a part of town that no longer existed. The area, labeled New Hope, had once been a vibrant black neighborhood, but there was no mention of what had happened to it. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. What had caused an entire community to vanish without a trace? The students, too, began to sense the weight of what they were uncovering. Conversations in the classroom became more heated, more emotional. Tommy argued with a classmate who dismissed the project as unnecessary. "It's our history," Tommy shouted. "You think it doesn't matter, but it does." Clara intervened, urging them to discuss their differences respectfully, but she couldn't deny the passion she saw in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that history wasn't just about dates and facts. It was about people, real people whose lives and stories had shaped their own. Meanwhile, outside the classroom, the town itself seemed to be shifting. Local newspapers picked up on the project, and an article about Clara's work ran on the front page. While some residents praised her for bringing new energy to the school, others were less supportive. Clara overheard whispers at the grocery store, saw the way some people avoided her on the sidewalk. She tried not to let it get to her, but the tension was undeniable. One day, Clara received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man named Mr. Harris showed up at her classroom door during her lunch break. He introduced himself as a lifelong resident of the town and said he had something to show her. Clara invited him in, and he pulled out a faded photograph from his coat pocket. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a church. "That's New Hope Baptist," Mr. Harris said, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. It was the heart of our community before it was torn down. Mr. Harris told Clara stories about the neighborhood that had once been full of laughter, music, and hard work. He spoke of how the community had banded together to support one another, even in the face of discrimination. But then the tone of his voice darkened. He described how the land had been taken from them, how homes and businesses were destroyed under the guise of progress. He looked Clara in the eye and said, "They didn't just take our land. They tried to take our history. Don't let them succeed." As Mr. Harris left, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She shared his stories with her students, who were both inspired and outraged. They began to see their town in a new light, questioning the monuments and plaques they had once walked past without a second thought. Who had been left out of these stories? What truths had been buried beneath the surface? The deeper they dug, the more they found. Old diaries, photographs, and oral histories painted a picture of resilience and injustice, of progress and setbacks. But with every discovery, the questions grew bigger. Why had these stories been hidden? Who had the power to decide what was remembered and what was forgotten? And what would it mean for the town to confront its past? By the time the project was nearing its end, the students and Clara had uncovered more than they ever imagined. But they also knew they were only scratching the surface. The more they learned, the more they realized there was still so much they didn't know. And with the tensions in the community growing, Clara began to wonder, how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? And what would happen if she did? The mood in the town was shifting, and Clara could feel it. What had started as a simple classroom project was now stirring up emotions far beyond the school walls. The stories her students uncovered had begun to ripple outward, touching families, neighborhoods, and even the town's leadership. The truth had a way of refusing to stay buried, and Clara wondered if the town was ready for what was surfacing. One evening, Clara received a phone call from Principal Edwards. He had been supportive of her project initially, seeing it as a way to engage the students, but his tone on the phone was different this time, guarded. He told her that several members of the school board were concerned about the direction of her lessons. "They think it's becoming too divisive," he said hesitantly, as if choosing his words carefully. Clara felt a pang of frustration, but kept her voice calm. "History isn't divisive," she replied. "Ignoring it is." Still, the warning hung over her like a storm cloud. Clara knew the school board wielded power, and their concerns weren't just idle complaints. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Her students were invested now, more passionate and engaged than she'd ever seen them. They were asking questions that challenged the narratives they'd been taught, and their discoveries were sparking conversations in their homes. One of her students, Angela, had taken the project particularly to heart. Angela's great-grandfather had been one of the first Black men in the town to own a piece of land, a small but significant victory in a time when such achievements were rare. But Angela's family had always been vague about what had happened to the land. Determined to find out, Angela spent hours digging through old property records with Clara's help. What they found shocked her: a document showing that the land had been seized under dubious circumstances, sold off for a fraction of its value, and later developed into what was now the town's main park. Angela's discovery hit a nerve, both for her and the town. When she shared her findings during a class discussion, the room fell silent. The weight of what she'd uncovered was undeniable. Tommy, who had already been grappling with the story of the burned general store, was the first to speak. "That's not right," he said, his voice tinged with anger. "They just took it." Angela nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "And no one did anything about it." Clara could see the mix of emotions on her students' faces: anger, sadness, confusion. They were beginning to understand how history wasn't just something that happened long ago. It was alive, shaping their town and their lives in ways they hadn't realized. But not everyone in the town shared their sense of urgency. As the project gained attention, so did the backlash. Clara began to notice subtle but chilling signs of resistance. A local columnist wrote an opinion piece accusing her of rewriting history to push an agenda. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes, warning that the project was tearing the community apart. Clara even overheard snippets of conversation at the diner, where she often went for coffee. People questioning why she couldn't just teach what's in the textbooks and leave it at that. Despite the pushback, Clara refused to give up. She reminded herself why she had taken on this project in the first place: to empower her students, to help them see the full picture of their town's history, and to honor the voices that had been silenced for too long. But the resistance wasn't just external. Clara began to sense cracks within her own circle of support. One afternoon, Clara stayed late to meet with a group of parents who had requested a meeting. She expected more criticism, but to her surprise, some parents were there to share their own stories. One man, Mr. Simmons, spoke about how his grandfather had helped build the New Hope Baptist Church, but had never been credited for his work. "My family's story is part of this town too," he said, his voice shaking. "People need to know that." But not all the parents were on Clara's side. One woman, Mrs. Henderson, accused her of brainwashing the students. "This is a small town," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone sharp. "We've always gotten along just fine. Why are you trying to stir things up?" Clara took a deep breath before responding. "I'm not stirring things up," she said. "I'm helping your children see the truth. They deserve to know the whole story." As tensions mounted, Clara found herself questioning how far she was willing to push. She knew the importance of the work they were doing, but she also knew the risks. What if the school board decided to shut her down? What if the community turned against her completely? And yet, every time she thought about stepping back, she remembered Mr. Harris's words, "Don't let them take our history." Meanwhile, the students were facing their own struggles. Angela's parents were proud of her for uncovering their family's history, but worried about the attention it was bringing. "Be careful," her mother warned. "Not everyone wants these stories to come out." Tommy found himself arguing with his father, who dismissed the project as unnecessary. "What's the point of digging up all this old stuff?" his father said. Tommy shot back, "Because it matters, Dad, it matters." Even Maria, who had been so moved by her great-grandfather's letters, started to feel the weight of what they were uncovering. One night, she confided in Clara. "What if we find out something that makes everything worse?" she asked quietly. Clara didn't have an easy answer. "The truth can be hard," she said, "but it's also powerful, and sometimes facing it is the only way to move forward." The conflict was growing, not just between Clara and the town, but within the town itself. Old wounds were being reopened, and the lines between past and present were blurring. Clara began to realize that the fight for truth wasn't just about history. It was about identity, justice, and the future of the community. And as the students continued to uncover more pieces of the puzzle, Clara knew they were heading toward a moment of reckoning. The question was, would the town be ready to face it? The unease in the town had become palpable. What began as whispers and quiet resistance had grown louder, more confrontational. Clara could feel it in the way people looked at her as she walked to school, the way conversations abruptly stopped when she entered a room. It was clear that the project had struck a nerve, and that frightened some people. But fear wasn't the only reaction. There was also a sense of hope, fragile but undeniable, stirring among those who had long felt invisible. One morning, as Clara arrived at school, she was greeted by a small group of parents and townspeople gathered outside the building. Some held signs of support, "Teach the truth" and "History matters," while others carried signs that read, "Leave the past in the past and stop dividing us." The sight sent a jolt through Clara. She hadn't expected this level of public reaction. She smiled at the supporters and walked past the others, keeping her head high, but her hands trembled as she unlocked her classroom door. Inside, her students were buzzing with energy, their voices a mix of excitement and apprehension. Angela showed Clara an article she had found in the town's old newspaper archives. The piece, dated 1927, reported on a land dispute involving several black families who had been forced to sell their properties under suspicious circumstances. The names listed in the article included Angela's great-grandfather and Maria's great-grandfather. The students were outraged. "This was planned," Maria said, her voice shaking. "They didn't just take the land, they erased the people who lived there." Tommy chimed in, holding up another piece of evidence, a faded photograph of a protest in front of the courthouse. The image showed men and women, black and white, holding signs demanding justice. "Why isn't this in any of the history books?" he asked, his frustration spilling over. "Why didn't anyone tell us this happened?" The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the discoveries pressing down on them. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Sometimes," she said, "people in power choose to tell only the stories that serve them. But it's up to us to uncover the rest, even if it's uncomfortable." Later that day, Clara was called into Principal Edwards' office. The principal's expression was grave as he gestured for her to sit. "Clara," he began, "the school board has received several complaints about the project. They're concerned it's causing too much division in the community." Clara stared at him, her heart sinking. "Division," she said, her voice rising. "We're uncovering the truth. How is that divisive?" Principal Edwards leaned forward, his voice low. "You and I both know this is important, but not everyone sees it that way." They scheduled a meeting to discuss whether the project should continue. "I wanted to give you a heads up." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She thanked him and left the office, her thoughts swirling. How could they shut this down now, when they were so close to uncovering the full story? That evening, Clara stayed up late, preparing for the school board meeting. She gathered evidence, student testimonies, and examples of the stories they had uncovered. She thought about Mr. Harris, about Angela's great-grandfather, about all the voices that had been silenced. She knew this wasn't just about a classroom project, it was about justice, about giving those voices a chance to be heard. The tension in the town reached a boiling point the day of the meeting. The school gymnasium was packed with people, parents, students, teachers, and community members. Clara sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The board members sat at a long table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. As the meeting began, people on both sides of the issue stepped forward to speak. A woman who introduced herself as a lifelong resident argued that the project was tearing the town apart. "We've lived here in peace for decades," she said. "Why bring up things that are better left buried?" Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from some in the crowd, but Clara noticed the tension in Angela's shoulders and the way Tommy clenched his fists. Then Mr. Harris stood up. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he told the story of New Hope Baptist Church and the vibrant community it had once served. "They tried to erase us," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But we're still here, and our stories deserve to be told." The room grew quiet as more people shared their thoughts. Angela's mother spoke about the importance of teaching the next generation the truth, no matter how painful. A man Clara didn't recognize stood up and defended the project, saying it had opened his eyes to parts of the town's history he'd never known. "It's not about division," he said. "It's about understanding." But not everyone was moved. A school board member leaned into his microphone and asked Clara directly, "Do you think this project is worth the controversy it's causing? Worth the harm it might be doing to the community?" Clara stood, her legs trembling but her voice firm. "History isn't about making people comfortable," she said. "It's about learning from the past so we can build a better future. This project has given my students a voice, and it's helped this town confront truths that have been hidden for too long. Yes, it's worth it." The room erupted in applause from some and angry muttering from others. Clara sat down, her heart pounding, as the board members whispered among themselves. She knew the decision they made tonight would shape not just the project, but the town's future. As the board prepared to announce its decision, Clara glanced at her students. They were watching her, their faces a mix of fear and hope. Whatever happened next, she knew they were ready to fight for the truth. The tension in the room was electric, and Clara held her breath, waiting to hear what would come next. The school board chair adjusted his microphone, the low feedback hum breaking the tense silence. Clara leaned forward, her palms pressed flat against the table in front of her, heart racing. The decision felt like it would come down to a single moment, but as the chair began to speak, the gym doors creaked open. Heads turned to see a man in his late 40s step inside, holding a stack of yellowed documents. His face was familiar to some but unrecognizable to others. He hesitated briefly, then walked purposefully to the front of the room. "My name is Robert Grayson," the man said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "My family has lived in this town for generations, and I have something to share that I think is important for everyone here to hear." Clara watched as he placed the papers on the table in front of the board. The chair frowned, but gestured for him to continue. Robert explained that he had stumbled across the documents while cleaning out his late father's office. What he found was shocking. Letters and meeting notes that detailed a decades-long effort by some of the town's most influential figures to erase the history of New Hope and other Black communities in the area. The papers included records of land seizures, attempts to block school funding, and even coordinated efforts to destroy archives. "These aren't just stories," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "These are facts. Proof of what so many people have been saying for years." The room erupted into chaos. Supporters of the project applauded loudly, while others shouted over one another, some accusing Robert of trying to stir up trouble. Clara sat frozen, absorbing the weight of what had just been revealed. This wasn't just about forgotten stories or lost neighborhoods anymore. This was a deliberate conspiracy, and the proof was now in the hands of the school board. Angela turned to Clara, her eyes wide. "Does this mean they can't ignore it now?" she whispered. Clara didn't have an answer. She wanted to believe that the truth would force action, but she also knew how deeply entrenched the resistance to change could be. The board chair called for order, his voice rising above the clamor. "We'll take this into consideration," he said, gesturing to the stack of documents Robert had left. But Clara could see the unease in his expression, the way his hands fidgeted as he shuffled papers on the table. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight. If anything, it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the town seemed to splinter further. The revelations from Robert's documents were the talk of every diner, church, and corner store. Some people were horrified, demanding accountability and action. Others were defensive, dismissing the documents as irrelevant or fabricated. Clara overheard conversations that made her stomach churn. Comments about how some things are better left in the past, or how this town doesn't need to be dragged through the mud. One afternoon, Clara was working late in her classroom when she noticed an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of names, most of them unfamiliar to her. At the bottom, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Ask them. They know." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Who had left the note? And why? The next day, she shared the note with her students, hoping they might recognize some of the names. To her surprise, Angela pointed to one immediately. "That's my great-aunt," she said. "She's in a nursing home now, but she's always talked about how much she remembers from back then." Tommy recognized another name as belonging to an elderly man who lived near his grandparents. "He doesn't talk much, but maybe he would if we asked the right questions," Tommy said. Clara hesitated. This felt bigger than a classroom project, bigger than anything she had expected when they started. But she could see the determination in her students' faces, the spark of something unstoppable. "Let's do it," she said finally. "But we need to be careful. This isn't just history, it's people's lives." As they began reaching out to the people on the list, more stories emerged. Stories of resilience, heartbreak, and betrayal. One elderly woman described how her family had been forced to leave New Hope after receiving threats. Another man shared memories of secret meetings held in basements and backyards, where community members planned ways to protect what little they had left. Each story added another layer to the history they were uncovering, and each one raised more questions. But not everyone was willing to talk. One man on the list slammed his door in Clara's face, muttering about how some things were better forgotten. Another woman refused to even open the door, shouting through the screen that she didn't want to get involved. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that some people were afraid of what might happen if the full truth came out. As the tension continued to build, Clara received another anonymous letter. This one was different from the first, longer, more detailed. It hinted at something even darker lurking beneath the surface, something that could explain why so many people were resistant to the project. "Look into the fire," the letter said. "The answers are there." Clara's mind raced. Was this a reference to the fire that had destroyed the general store Tommy had researched? Or was it something else entirely? She shared the letter with her students, and together they began piecing together clues from everything they had uncovered so far. The connections were murky, but one thing was clear. Whatever they were uncovering went deeper than anyone had realized. The stakes had never been higher, and Clara knew they were on the verge of something big. But as they pushed closer to the truth, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was determined to stop them. The question was, how far would they go to protect the secrets of the past? The evening of the town hall meeting arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. It was standing room only, with people from every corner of the community packed into the auditorium. Clara stood near the back, her students clustered around her. They had spent the past week piecing together the final threads of the story, determined to share what they'd found. But even Clara wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. The meeting opened with a tense silence as the school board addressed the room. The chair, clearly trying to project calm, announced they would be discussing the findings of Clara's project and the implications for the community. Then, to Clara's surprise, Robert Grayson was invited to speak again. He walked to the podium, holding not just the stack of documents he had shared earlier, but something new, a small wooden box, worn and dusty, as if it had been hidden away for years. Robert began by recounting his earlier revelation, the letters and records detailing the systematic erasure of New Hope's history. But then he opened the box and held up an old, blackened ledger. "This," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "is the missing ledger from the general store that burned down all those years ago." The room erupted into murmurs and gasps. Clara's heart raced as Robert opened the ledger and began to read. The pages listed names of customers, debts owed, and payments made, but also something else. There were notes about meetings held in the store's backroom, meetings where members of the Black community and sympathetic allies planned ways to resist the land seizures and other injustices they faced. The ledger documented these efforts in detail, including a list of participants, some of whom were prominent figures in the town's history. One name stood out: James Grayson, Robert's great-grandfather. The revelation sent a ripple through the room. The Grayson family had long been seen as one of the town's most powerful and respected white families. The idea that one of their own had worked with New Hope's Black community to resist injustice was shocking to many. But Robert wasn't done. He flipped to the final pages of the ledger, where the handwriting changed abruptly. The entries detailed a growing tension between the store's owner, Mr. Johnson, and a group of local businessmen who were unhappy with his efforts to support the Black community. The last entry was chilling. "They're coming tonight. If I don't make it, tell the others to keep fighting." Clara felt a lump in her throat as the weight of those words sank in. The fire that destroyed the store hadn't been an accident. It had been an attack, a deliberate act to silence Mr. Johnson and destroy the evidence of his efforts to help the community. As Robert stepped down from the podium, the room erupted into chaos. Some people shouted in anger, others in disbelief. The school board chair called for order, but it was clear the revelation had shaken the community to its core. Clara looked at her students, their faces a mix of shock and determination. "We have to finish this," Angela whispered. Clara nodded, knowing she was right. The final twist came when Angela's great-aunt, who had been too frail to attend the meeting, sent a message through her daughter. The note was simple but devastating. "There's one more thing you need to know. The land they took, it wasn't just about money. They were looking for something. The cryptic message sent Clara and her students back into research mode. Late that night, as they pored over maps and records, Tommy stumbled across an old surveyor's report. It described the land beneath New Hope as rich in natural resources, particularly a rare mineral used in construction at the time. The land seizures hadn't just been about displacing the black community. They had been a calculated effort to exploit the land's hidden wealth. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about prejudice or power. It was about greed on a scale no one had imagined. Clara felt a mix of anger and resolve. The story had to be told, not just for New Hope, but for every community that had been erased, exploited, or silenced. At the next town meeting, Clara's students presented their findings. They spoke with courage and clarity, weaving together the threads of history, personal stories, and hard evidence. The room was silent as Angela finished by reading a passage from her great-grandfather's journal. "We may lose the fight today, but the truth will always find a way." Then, as the meeting ended, Clara looked around the room. Some faces were tear-streaked, others revealed. The town couldn't go back to the way it had been, not after this. Outside, as Clara and her students stepped into the cool night air, she felt a sense of closure, but also a realization. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the community would have to decide how to reckon with its past and move forward together. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt hope. As the crowd dispersed into the cool night, Clara lingered with her students under the soft glow of the streetlights. The energy in the air was a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had done it. They had uncovered the truth and shared it with the town. But now came the hardest part, figuring out what to do with everything they had learned. Angela turned to Clara, her expression a mix of pride and apprehension. "Do you think anything will actually change?" she asked softly. Clara thought about it for a moment, the weight of the question settling in her chest. "Change is slow," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But we've started something that can't be ignored. That's the first step." Over the next few weeks, the revelations sparked ripples across the town. The school board voted unanimously to keep the project alive, agreeing that the history uncovered needed to be integrated into the curriculum. Clara's students began working on a comprehensive presentation that could be shared with the entire community, blending stories, documents, and photographs into a powerful narrative. They called it The Voices of New Hope. Word of the project spread beyond the town. Local journalists picked up the story, and soon regional news outlets were covering it too. People from neighboring towns reached out, sharing their own stories of forgotten communities and hidden histories. Clara was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but also struck by how common these stories seem to be. "It's like there's a whole hidden world just waiting to be uncovered," she said one evening to Mr. Harris, who had become a steadfast ally and mentor throughout the process. Mr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "That's because there is," he replied. "But the hardest part isn't finding the stories. It's making sure they're never forgotten again." As the town grappled with its newly unearthed history, a group of residents formed a committee to restore the New Hope Baptist Church. The crumbling structure, long abandoned, had become a powerful symbol of resilience and remembrance. Volunteers gathered every weekend, sanding, painting, and rebuilding. Clara's students often joined in, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they worked side by side with older residents who shared their memories of the church's heyday. Angela's great-aunt, who had been hesitant to speak at first, became one of the committee's most vocal advocates. She would sit in a chair near the construction site, telling stories to anyone who would listen. "This isn't just about a building," she said one day, her voice strong despite her frail frame. "It's about a community that refused to disappear." The project also brought unexpected connections. Robert Grayson, once hesitant to confront his family's role in the town's history, became an outspoken advocate for reconciliation and reparative efforts. He worked closely with the committee, using his resources to help fund the restoration of the church and other historical sites. His willingness to confront his family's legacy inspired others in the town to reflect on their own histories. For Clara, the most profound moments came in her classroom. Her students, who had started this journey as curious teenagers, had grown into passionate advocates for truth and justice. They debated fiercely about what the town should do next, brainstorming ways to ensure the lessons of New Hope would be passed down to future generations. Maybe we could create a museum, Tommy suggested one day, or a walking tour of all the important sites. Maria, who had initially been shy about speaking up, chimed in. We should write a book, she said. Not just about New Hope, but about everything we've learned, so other people can do this in their towns too. Clara beamed with pride. I think those are all incredible ideas, she said, and I think you're the perfect people to make them happen. As the months passed, the town began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being held openly. The local library expanded its archives to include stories and documents related to New Hope, and the high school established an annual project for students to research and present on the town's history. Clara's classroom became a hub of activity, with students from all grades eager to learn more about the project that had reshaped their community. But not everyone was ready to embrace the change. There were still murmurs of resistance, still people who clung to the idea that the past should stay buried. Clara encountered pushback now and then, but she had learned to hold her ground. She reminded herself of the voices they had uncovered, the lives they had honored. The work wasn't for the naysayers, it was for the truth and the future. One sunny afternoon, as the restored New Hope Baptist Church held its reopening ceremony, Clara stood among the crowd, watching as Angela and Maria read from their great-grandfather's journals. Their voices were steady and clear, carrying the words of men who had fought to be remembered. Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had taken together, for the courage her students had shown. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Clara lingered near the church steps, taking it all in. Mr. Harris joined her, leaning on his cane but smiling broadly. You've done something incredible here, he said. You've given this town a second chance. Clara shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. We've all done it together, she said, and it's just the beginning. The town wasn't perfect, and the work was far from over. But the cracks that had once divided it were now filled with something stronger. Understanding, empathy, and a commitment to never let history be forgotten again. As Clara walked back toward her car, surrounded by the laughter of her students and the chatter of the community, she felt a sense of peace. The voices of New Hope had been heard, and they would continue to echo for generations to come.